The courtroom fell into a deep, eerie silence. Every eye was glued to the arrogant billionaire, seated smugly in his chair. He hadn't moved an inch since the judge had entered. His arms were crossed, and his face held a slight smirk as if he found the entire situation amusing. "Sir, stand for the judge," the bailiff repeated, his voice firm. The billionaire, Jackson Whitmore, didn't even blink. "I don't stand for anyone," he said casually, as if he were refusing an extra glass of wine at a dinner party. The room gasped. No one had ever seen such disrespect in a courtroom. The female judge, a woman with sharp eyes and a presence that commanded respect, remained silent for a moment. "Mr. Whitmore," she finally said, her voice steady. "This is my courtroom. You will stand." Jackson leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the table. "No thanks." There was another gasp, followed by an uncomfortable shuffling of feet. No one dared to speak. Even Jackson's high-priced legal team looked like they wanted to disappear into the ground. That's when Judge Evelyn Carter did something no one expected. She reached for her gavel, held it in the air, and crack! The loudest slam of a gavel anyone had ever heard echoed through the room. The sound vibrated through the walls, sending a chill down everyone's spine. And then, "Bailiff, take Mr. Whitmore into custody for contempt of court." The billionaire's smirk finally faded. Hours earlier, Jackson Whitmore had woken up in his penthouse, stretching lazily in his silk sheets. His bedroom was larger than most people's entire homes, and outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, the skyline of New York glittered under the morning sun. His assistant, Nathan, was already waiting by the door with his schedule. "You have a court hearing today," Nathan reminded him. Jackson barely listened. "Not worried," he said, grabbing his espresso from the marble counter. "I have the best lawyers in the country." Nathan hesitated. "Sir, this judge, Evelyn Carter, she's not someone who can be easily swayed." Jackson let out a laugh. "Please, everyone has a price." Nathan didn't argue, but the worried look in his eyes said everything. By the time Jackson's black Rolls-Royce pulled up to the courthouse, reporters swarmed him, flashing cameras and shouting questions. He ignored them, walking in with his usual air of confidence. Inside, the tension was thick. His case was high-profile, accusations of fraud, mistreatment of employees, and bribing officials. The media had already labeled him the untouchable billionaire. Jackson, however, wasn't worried. He knew how to play the system. Then Judge Evelyn Carter entered. She was nothing like he expected. He had pictured an old woman, frail and easy to manipulate. Instead, she was tall, poised, and radiated authority. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had fought battles and won. Still, Jackson barely acknowledged her. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. That was when it happened. "Please stand for the judge." Jackson didn't. And now, as the echoes of the judge's gavel still rang in the air, Jackson sat frozen. His arrogance had finally met a force he couldn't ignore. The bailiff approached. The audience held their breath. Jackson's expensive lawyers jumped up, scrambling for a response. But before they could say anything, the bailiff grabbed Jackson's arm. For the first time in his life, Jackson Whitmore was being escorted away like an ordinary criminal. The courtroom erupted in whispers. "What's going to happen to him?" someone muttered. Jackson tried to resist, but the bailiff tightened his grip. His lawyers were already arguing with the judge, but she remained calm, flipping through papers as if she hadn't just thrown one of the wealthiest men in the country into chaos. Jackson gritted his teeth. This wasn't over. And then, just as he was being let out, Judge Carter looked up and met his eyes. And she smiled. Jackson Whitmore had never felt so humiliated in his life. As the bailiff led him out of the courtroom, the murmurs of the crowd followed him like a shadow. He had walked into this courthouse believing it would be nothing more than an inconvenience. Another legal game where money would clear his path as always. But now he was being dragged away like some lowly criminal. His jaw tightened as he glanced back over his shoulder. Judge Evelyn Carter was still seated at the bench, flipping through case files, completely unfazed. The slight, knowing smile on her face sent a fresh wave of fury through his veins. She had planned this. She wanted to embarrass him. The moment they reached the hallway, his lawyers rushed after them. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," one of them shouted, running up to the judge's bench. Mr. Whitmore did not pose a threat to this courtroom. He refused to follow court protocol. Judge Carter interrupted smoothly, without looking up. That is contempt. The lawyer adjusted his tie, looking flustered. But, my courtroom, my rules. She cut in, finally meeting his gaze. I don't care how rich he is. I don't care how many powerful friends he has. If he refuses to respect the law, he will face the consequences like everyone else. Meanwhile, in the hallway, Jackson's hands clenched into fists as the bailiff tightened his grip. Unhand me, Jackson snapped. Do you have any idea who I am? The bailiff gave a dry chuckle. Oh, we all know who you are, Mr. Whitmore. A few steps later, they reached a holding cell, a dimly lit space with a steel bench and a metal toilet in the corner. The billionaire recoiled in disgust. You can't be serious. The bailiff opened the door. Enjoy your stay. Before Jackson could protest, the door shut behind him with a loud clang. The sound of metal locks clicking into place sent a chilling realization through him. He was locked up. The cameras outside the courtroom had caught every second of his public humiliation. The media would be in a frenzy. His hands trembled with rage. He pulled out his phone, but as he tapped the screen, nothing happened. No service. His lawyers had better fix this fast. He wouldn't last an hour in this place. Back in the courtroom, Judge Carter continued as if nothing had happened. She moved through the docket, calling up the next case. The audience, still shaken by the billionaire's dramatic exit, struggled to focus. Yet, beneath her calm exterior, Judge Carter felt a quiet satisfaction. For years, men like Jackson Whitmore had walked into courtrooms believing they were untouchable. They had cheated, lied, and trampled over the weak, only to walk away free because they could afford the best lawyers. Not this time. Not in her courtroom. Still, she knew this wasn't over. Men like Jackson didn't stay silent for long. And as if on cue, her clerk approached, whispering in her ear, his legal team is already filing an emergency motion to have him released. Judge Carter sighed, setting down her pen. Of course they are. This was only the beginning. Hours passed. Jackson sat in his holding cell, his patience running thin. He had spent the last 20 minutes pacing like a caged lion, cursing under his breath. He could not believe this was happening. This was supposed to be a simple hearing. He should have been out by now, having lunch at some exclusive restaurant, laughing at how easy the legal system was to manipulate. But instead, he was stuck here. The thought made his blood boil. Just then, the metal door creaked open. A guard stepped in. Time's up, Whitmore. The judge wants to see you. Jackson's head snapped up. His legal team must have worked their magic. Finally, he was getting out of this filthy cell. Straightening his suit, he smirked. About time. He followed the guard down the hallway, his confidence returning with every step. By the time they reached the courtroom doors, he had already planned his next move. He would make sure Judge Carter regretted humiliating him today. Maybe a strategic lawsuit? A few well-placed political favors? He was Jackson Whitmore. He always won. The doors swung open. The courtroom was packed again, all eyes turning toward him as he entered. His lawyers sat stiffly at the defense table, whispering urgently among themselves. Judge Carter was already seated, watching him carefully. Jackson sauntered forward, keeping his expression cool. Well, Judge, let's get this over with, he said arrogantly, taking a seat. I assume you realized your mistake and decided to let me go. Judge Carter steepled her fingers, unfazed. Actually, Mr. Whitmore, I've decided to extend your time in custody. A stunned silence filled the room. Jackson's smirk vanished. His lawyers jumped up. Your Honor, this is outrageous. We filed for an immediate release. I reviewed it. Judge Carter nodded. And I denied it. Jackson's heart pounded. You can't do that. She raised an eyebrow. I can, and I just did. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Jackson, for the first time in his life, looked truly shaken. Judge Carter leaned forward. You seem to believe the law doesn't apply to you. Consider this a reminder that it does. Jackson swallowed hard. This was not how things were supposed to go. And then, the judge delivered the final blow. You will remain in custody for the next 48 hours. Gasps filled the room. Jackson shot up from his seat. You can't do this. I have business meetings. You have 48 hours, she repeated firmly. Bailiff, escort him back to his cell. As the bailiff grabbed Jackson's arm once more, he felt his world crumbling around him. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience anymore. This was war. Jackson Whitmore had always been a man in control. He controlled markets. He controlled politicians. He controlled the lives of thousands of employees who depended on his company's paychecks. But now he was just another prisoner, sitting in a cold, gray cell with nothing but the sound of his own breathing to keep him company. His lawyers had failed. Judge Carter had humiliated him. And worst of all, the news was everywhere. His name was trending. Every major news outlet was covering the story. Arrogant billionaire refuses to stand for female judge, immediately regrets it. Justice served. Jackson Whitmore faces contempt charges. The untouchable billionaire finally gets touched by the law. Jackson clenched his fists so hard his nails nearly dug into his skin. He was seething. This was a public relations disaster. Stockholders would panic. Investors would start questioning his leadership. His business empire, his legacy, was under attack. All because of that woman. Judge Carter. A nobody. A public servant who probably lived in a tiny apartment and drove a modest car. Someone who had no right to challenge him. Jackson's thoughts were interrupted when the metal door swung open again. A different guard stepped in this time, older and more relaxed than the last. He carried a tray of food, if it could even be called that. Dinner time, Whitmore, the guard said, sliding the tray through the slot. Jackson scoffed. You expect me to eat this garbage? The guard smirked. Welcome to the real world, billionaire. Jackson barely spared the food a glance. A lump of mashed potatoes, some unidentifiable meat, and a stale piece of bread. He shoved the tray away in disgust. He wouldn't eat this. He wouldn't drink the lukewarm water they had given him earlier. By tomorrow, his lawyers would get him out, and this would all be a bad memory. At least, that's what he thought. Until the next morning came. And he was still there. The sun barely crept through the tiny window of Jackson's holding cell. His back ached from sleeping on the rock-hard bench, and his head pounded from lack of food. He had never felt more miserable. His lawyers should have fixed this by now. What were they doing? Just as frustration reached its peak, footsteps echoed outside. The metal door swung open, and in stepped a familiar face. Nathan. Jackson's assistant looked horrible. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, and his expression screamed exhaustion. Jackson shot up from the bench. Finally. What took you so long? Nathan hesitated. Sir, there's a problem. Jackson narrowed his eyes. Problem? What problem? Nathan swallowed hard. Judge Carter isn't budging. She rejected every appeal. The media is loving this story, and he hesitated, shifting nervously. And what? Jackson snapped. Nathan sighed. Some of your business partners are distancing themselves. Jackson's blood ran cold. What do you mean, distancing themselves? Nathan pulled out his phone and showed him a headline. Whitmore Corporation stock plummets after CEO's arrest. Jackson grabbed the phone, scrolling rapidly. Statements from his own investors flooded the screen. We do not condone Mr. Whitmore's behavior. We will be re-evaluating our relationship with Whitmore Corporation. Leadership matters. We expect better. Jackson felt his chest tighten. This was worse than he thought. He wasn't just being humiliated. His empire was crumbling. And it wasn't over yet. Because just as Nathan prepared to speak again, the door swung open. A guard stood there, arms crossed. Time's up, he said. You're going back to the courtroom. Jackson blinked. What? What? The guard smirked. Judge Carter wants to have a little chat. The courtroom was just as packed as before. Reporters lined the benches, waiting for their next big headline. As Jackson entered, he forced himself to straighten his shoulders, to pretend he wasn't rattled. But the moment he met Judge Carter's gaze, something inside him wavered. She was calm, collected, in control, the exact opposite of how he felt. He sat down at the defense table, glaring at her. Let's get this over with. Judge Carter studied him for a moment. Then, she spoke. You've spent a night in custody, Mr. Whitmore. How does it feel? Jackson scoffed. Like a joke. The audience murmured. Judge Carter nodded, unfazed. Interesting. Because I imagine the workers you fired without warning, the families who lost their homes due to your shady business deals, and the people who trusted you with their savings probably felt the same way. Jackson clenched his jaw. She leaned forward. Do you think you're above the law? I think the law is a tool, Jackson said coldly. And I know how to use it better than most. Silence. Judge Carter sighed. Then I suppose you won't mind another 48 hours in custody. Jackson's heart stopped. His lawyers erupted. Your Honor, this is an abuse of power. Abuse of power? Judge Carter repeated, raising an eyebrow. Now you're concerned about that? Jackson's stomach churned. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Before he could protest, the judge picked up her gavel. Mr. Whitmore, you will remain in custody for another 48 hours. Bang! The courtroom exploded with gasps. Jackson shot up, his face red with fury. This is illegal. I'll destroy you for this. Judge Carter didn't flinch. Bailiff, take him away. The bailiff grabbed his arm, leading him back toward the exit. But just before Jackson was dragged out, Judge Carter said something that stopped him cold. Mr. Whitmore, maybe it's time you learn. The world doesn't revolve around you. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Jackson didn't say another word as he was pulled away, because for the first time in his life, he realized he was losing. Jackson Whitmore was unraveling. The second the cell door clanged shut behind him, he slammed his fist against the cold, hard wall. Another 48 hours. That woman, that judge, was playing a game he didn't know how to win. His whole life, he had bent the world to his will. He had crushed competitors, bought out enemies, and used his power like a hammer. But Judge Evelyn Carter wasn't afraid of him. That terrified him more than he wanted to admit. The worst part? His empire was slipping through his fingers. His lawyers had failed. His investors were panicking. His company's stock was bleeding. And now, trapped in a filthy cell, he had nothing. No luxury, no power, no control, just silence. For the first time in his life, Jackson felt small. Hours later, he heard footsteps approaching. The cell door opened, and Nathan walked in, his expression tense. Jackson shot up. Tell me you have good news. Nathan didn't speak right away. That was a bad sign. Jackson clenched his jaw. Talk. Nathan exhaled. Sir, we have a problem. Jackson folded his arms. Another one? Nathan hesitated. Your board of directors is considering a motion to replace you. Jackson froze. What did you just say? Nathan's voice was quiet. They're losing faith. If this drags out much longer, they might vote you out as CEO. Jackson's blood turned ice cold. He had built that company. It was his. No one had the right to take it away from him. His hands trembled. Who's leading this? Nathan swallowed. Your CFO, Richard Graves. Jackson's lips curled in rage. That snake. Richard had always wanted his position. Jackson knew that. But he never thought the man had the guts to make a move. Judge Carter had just handed him the perfect opportunity. Jackson paced, running a hand through his hair. I need to get out of here. Now. Nathan hesitated. There might be a way. Jackson's head snapped up. What? Nathan exhaled. Judge Carter agreed to reconsider your release if, he hesitated again. If what? Jackson snapped. Nathan looked him dead in the eyes. If you apologize. Silence. Jackson's entire body stiffened. No, he said instantly. Nathan sighed. Sir, I'm not apologizing. Nathan rubbed his temples. Jackson, this isn't about your pride. Jackson's glare was sharp enough to cut glass. I don't bow to anyone. Nathan's face was unreadable. Then he said something that made Jackson's heart stop. Then you might lose everything. Jackson stared. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure what to do. The next morning, Jackson was pulled from his cell once again. The courtroom was just as crowded as before. Reporters were hungry for the next headline. Jackson sat down, his pulse pounding. His lawyers whispered rapidly in his ear, but he barely heard them. His mind was stuck on one thing. The apology. He never apologized. Not to anyone. Not even when he was wrong. Judge Carter watched him with that same calm, unreadable expression. Mr. Whitmore, she began. Have you had time to reflect on your actions? Jackson's fingers curled into his palms. He could end this right now. Say the words. Get out. Fix his company. Take revenge. But the words wouldn't come. Judge Carter tilted her head. Do you have something to say? The courtroom was silent. Jackson opened his mouth. Then, bang. The courtroom doors slammed open. Everyone turned, shocked. A man in a sharp suit strode in. Richard Graves, Jackson's CFO. He walked straight up to the legal team and whispered something. Jackson's lawyer paled. Judge Carter frowned. Is there a reason you're interrupting my courtroom? Richard smirked. I have an important update, Your Honor. He turned toward Jackson and smiled. As of this morning, Jackson Whitmore is no longer CEO of Whitmore Corporation. Jackson's entire world shattered. The courtroom erupted in gasps. His hands shook. His company. Gone. Just. Like. That. Judge Carter remained silent, watching Jackson carefully. For the first time in his life, Jackson had lost, and there was nothing he could do about it. Jackson Whitmore couldn't breathe. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as Richard Graves' words replayed over and over in his head. As of this morning, Jackson Whitmore is no longer CEO of Whitmore Corporation. His company, his legacy, his entire empire, gone. He barely heard the gasps in the courtroom, barely noticed the camera flashes going off like fireworks. All he could do was stare at Richard, the man he had once trusted, standing there with that smug little smirk. That should be me. Jackson gritted his teeth, his entire body shaking. You're lying. Richard tilted his head. Am I? Jackson turned to his lawyers. They looked miserable. None of them would meet his gaze. It was true. It had really happened. Jackson snapped. You backstabbing. Pathetic. He lunged forward, but the bailiff yanked him back before he could rip Richard apart. The courtroom erupted. Judge Carter slammed her gavel. Bang, bang, bang. Order, she demanded. Jackson was fuming. His blood boiled, his vision blurred with rage. Richard just smiled. Relax, Jackson. I'm just cleaning up your mess. Jackson's fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. You think you can run my company better than me? Richard shrugged. Well, the board certainly thinks so. Jackson could barely control himself. Every fiber of his being screamed to fight back. Then Judge Carter spoke. Enough. The single word cut through the tension like a blade. Jackson turned toward her, chest heaving. Judge Carter stared at him with an expression he couldn't quite place. Not smug. Not mocking. Just calm. Mr. Whitmore, she said. It seems the world is moving on without you. Her words hit harder than a slap. Jackson froze. Judge Carter leaned forward. So, I'll ask you again. Silence filled the room. Do you have anything to say? Jackson felt trapped. This was his last chance. His one shot to salvage something. Anything. He could swallow his pride and apologize. Or he could double down. He took a slow breath. His entire life had led to this moment. Every decision, every deal, every ruthless action. And for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Doubt. His throat felt dry. The words sat at the edge of his tongue, but he couldn't say them. Instead, he muttered through clenched teeth. This isn't over. Judge Carter sighed. Very well, she said, shaking her head. Mr. Whitmore, I'm extending your custody for another 24 hours. Jackson's stomach dropped. More time? His lawyers jumped up. Your Honor, this is my decision, Judge Carter interrupted. Mr. Whitmore still refuses to acknowledge his wrongdoing. She tapped her gavel once. Court is dismissed. Jackson barely heard anything else. His mind was screaming. His company was gone. His money wouldn't save him. And that woman had locked him away again. As the bailiff dragged him back toward the holding cell, he turned to Richard. Richard winked. And that was the moment Jackson realized the truth. He wasn't just losing. He had already lost. Back in his cell, the walls felt smaller. Jackson sat on the metal bench, staring at his hands. This can't be happening. For years, he had been untouchable. No one had ever made him feel powerless. And yet, here he was, locked up, exiled from his own company, with the entire world watching his downfall. The worst part? There was no one to blame but himself. Hours later, Nathan returned. Jackson barely lifted his head. Nathan cleared his throat. Sir, I just got word. The board has officially announced Richard as interim CEO. Jackson winced. It was official. His company wasn't his anymore. Nathan hesitated. Sir, maybe it's time. Jackson frowned. Time for what? Nathan sighed. To admit you were wrong. Silence. Jackson scowled. You sound like them. Nathan's expression hardened. And maybe that's the problem. Jackson looked away. For the first time in years, he felt something he never allowed himself to feel. Doubt. Nathan adjusted his tie. You're running out of chances, sir. If you don't change something, you might not have anything left. Jackson swallowed. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure what to do next. And that terrified him more than anything. Jackson Whitmore sat alone in his cell, the weight of his downfall pressing against his chest like a crushing force. For the first time in his life, he had nothing. No power. No control. No way out. Nathan's words still rang in his ears. If you don't change something, you might not have anything left. Jackson scoffed under his breath, shaking his head. Change? Why should he change? He had built an empire by being ruthless, by never backing down, by never showing weakness. And yet, where had that gotten him? A cold, metal bench. A prison meal he refused to eat. A company that was no longer his. And the whole world watching his humiliation. He hated this feeling. He hated her. Judge Carter. She was doing this on purpose. She wanted to break him. But Jackson Whitmore didn't break. Did he? His thoughts were interrupted by footsteps. The guard appeared, unlocking the door. Time to go. Jackson stood up, forcing himself to straighten his shoulders. This time, he wasn't going to lose. The courtroom was even more packed than before. More cameras, more reporters, more eyes waiting for his next mistake. Jackson hated it. He took his seat, keeping his expression cold and unreadable. Judge Carter studied him. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "you've had another 24 hours to reflect. Do you have anything to say?" Jackson clenched his jaw. He wanted to tell her to go to hell. He wanted to tell all of them that they were beneath him. But his company was gone. His empire was crumbling. And for the first time in his life, he was truly alone. His mind screamed at him to fight back, to hold on to his pride. But then, a thought slipped through. What if Nathan was right? What if he was the problem? The words sat in his throat like a stone. Then, finally, after a long silence, he exhaled and did the one thing he swore he'd never do. He looked up at Judge Carter and said, "I was wrong." The entire courtroom froze. The murmurs, the whispers, the camera clicks, everything stopped. Judge Carter didn't react, waiting patiently. Jackson swallowed, forcing himself to continue. "I was wrong," he repeated, the words bitter on his tongue. "I should have stood. I should have respected this court." The moment felt like it lasted forever. Then, Judge Carter finally spoke. "I see," she said simply. Jackson's fists tightened. He had done what she wanted. Wasn't that enough? But Judge Carter leaned forward. "Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, are you apologizing because you mean it? Or because you want your power back?" Jackson flinched. For once, he didn't have an answer. He sat there, stunned, as Judge Carter studied him. Then, she sighed. "I'm releasing you." The courtroom exploded. Gasps. Murmurs. Reporters scrambling to take notes. Jackson barely heard any of it. He was free. But as the bailiff unlocked his handcuffs, Jackson realized something terrifying. He was free, but he had nowhere to go. His company wasn't waiting for him. His power was gone. And for the first time in his life, he had to figure out who he was without it. Outside the courthouse, the media storm was relentless. Cameras flashed in his face. Reporters screamed questions. "Mr. Whitmore, do you regret your actions? Are you going to fight for your company? Has Judge Carter humbled you?" Jackson ignored them all, shoving past the crowd. His car was waiting at the curb. Nathan stood beside it, looking relieved. As soon as Jackson got in, Nathan shut the door behind him. Silence. Jackson exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Drive." The car pulled away, the courthouse fading into the distance. Jackson stared out the window, his mind spinning. Everything felt different. For years, he had been the king of the world. Untouchable. Unstoppable. Now he was just a man. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea what came next. The ride from the courthouse was silent. Jackson Whitmore sat in the back of his luxury car, staring blankly out the window. The city streets blurred past him, but for the first time, they didn't feel like his kingdom. He was no longer the man people bowed to. No longer the billionaire who controlled everything. Now he was just another scandal. Nathan sat beside him, checking his phone. Every few seconds, he'd glance at Jackson, as if expecting him to explode. But Jackson felt numb. His name was still trending on every platform. His face was plastered across every major news site. And worst of all, his company was gone. This isn't happening. He had lost court battles before. He had faced bad press. But this was different. Because this time, he wasn't sure how to fix it. The car finally pulled up in front of his penthouse building. Nathan opened the door, waiting for Jackson to move. He didn't. For a long moment, he just stared at the entrance. His home. His empire. But was it still his? Nathan cleared his throat. "Sir." Jackson exhaled sharply and stepped out. As soon as he walked into the building, he felt it. The shift. The doorman, who once scrambled to greet him with a nervous smile, now barely nodded. The receptionist didn't even look up. Whispers followed him as he walked through the lobby. He clenched his fists. This was what losing really felt like. Up in his penthouse, everything was exactly the same. The polished marble floors. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The modern, sleek furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. Nothing had changed. Except him. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat down on the couch. Nathan stood awkwardly near the entrance. "Sir, I don't want a speech," Jackson cut him off. Nathan sighed. Fine, but I have to ask, what's next? Jackson swirled his drink. Next, your company is gone. Your reputation is in flames. Investors have cut ties. Nathan folded his arms. You need a plan. Jackson let out a bitter chuckle. You think I don't know that? Nathan hesitated, then took a slow breath. So what are you going to do? Jackson exhaled. He didn't have an answer. For the first time in his life, he had no idea what to do. The next morning, Jackson woke up to bad news. He barely slept. The whiskey didn't help. Nothing did. When he checked his phone, headlines flooded his screen. Richard Graves declares Whitmore Corporation will thrive without its former leader. Jackson Whitmore's net worth drops by billions overnight. Is this the end of an empire? Jackson clenched his jaw. Richard was everywhere, giving interviews, smiling, acting like he had saved the company from disaster. That should be me. His phone buzzed. A text from Nathan. You need to see this. A link followed. Jackson clicked it. It was a clip of Judge Carter. She was at a charity event, standing in front of a crowd, speaking into a microphone. Jackson's eyes narrowed. People like Jackson Whitmore have spent their lives believing the rules don't apply to them, she said. But the law doesn't care about power. It doesn't care about wealth. She glanced at the camera. And if there's one lesson I hope he's learned, it's that respect is something money can't buy. The audience cheered. Jackson nearly threw his phone. She's still talking about me? His blood boiled. Judge Carter thought she had won. She thought she had taught him a lesson. Jackson gritted his teeth. She thinks I'm finished. His fists clenched. But he wasn't. Not even close. For the first time since stepping out of that cell, Jackson felt something other than defeat. Determination. He may have lost the battle. But the war? The war wasn't over. And Judge Carter was about to find out exactly who she was dealing with. Jackson Whitmore had spent his entire life winning. And now, for the first time, the world expected him to stay down. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Judge Carter thought she had ended him. Richard Graves thought he had replaced him. The media thought he was finished. Jackson smirked. Let them think that. Because while they were celebrating his downfall, he was already planning his comeback. Nathan arrived at the penthouse an hour later. He barely stepped inside before Jackson threw a folder onto the table. Nathan hesitated. What's this? Jackson leaned back, sipping his coffee like nothing was wrong. A plan. Nathan picked up the folder and flipped it open. His eyes widened. You're serious? Jackson grinned. Dead serious. Nathan looked over the pages. His usual professionalism faltered. Sir, you can't be thinking about launching a takeover. Jackson's smirk didn't fade. Richard stole my company, he said. I'm stealing it back. Nathan sighed. Jackson, your stock is plummeting. You don't have the same influence. The board is full of cowards. Jackson's voice was ice. They abandoned me the second things got rough. Nathan exhaled. And Judge Carter? Jackson's smirk twitched. What about her? Nathan folded his arms. She's not done with you. Jackson's jaw tightened. That woman, she had humiliated him, exposed his weaknesses. But what infuriated him most wasn't the punishment. It was the fact that, deep down, a small part of him knew she was right. That thought made him sick. So he buried it. She's old news, Jackson said coldly. This isn't about her. Nathan didn't look convinced. But Jackson didn't care. He wasn't here to reflect. He was here to win. The next few days were a storm. Jackson worked relentlessly. Calls, meetings, backdoor deals, every trick in the book. He contacted old allies, whispered the right words to the right people. And slowly, his influence began to rebuild. The media thought he was hiding. Instead, he was hunting. But then, something unexpected happened. Nathan burst into the penthouse late one evening, his face pale. Sir, he panted. You need to see this. Jackson barely looked up from his laptop. Unless it's Richard's resignation, I don't care. Nathan hesitated. It's about Judge Carter. Jackson's fingers froze on the keyboard. Slowly, he turned. What about her? Nathan handed him a phone. Jackson grabbed it, frowning at the article on the screen. Breaking news. Judge Carter's passed under scrutiny. Did she bend the law in a previous case? Jackson's eyes narrowed. He scrolled. A decade-old case. A controversial ruling. Some whispers of misconduct. Nothing concrete, but enough for the media to latch onto. Enough to make her look vulnerable. Nathan shifted uncomfortably. It's already spreading. Jackson tapped his fingers against the phone. He should have felt satisfaction. After all, she had ruined him. Wasn't this karma? But instead, something unfamiliar settled in his chest. Doubt. Because unlike Richard, unlike the board, Judge Carter hadn't acted out of greed. She had done what she thought was right. And now, she was in the same position he had been in just days ago. Under attack. Jackson exhaled, setting the phone down. Nathan frowned. What are you thinking? Jackson didn't answer right away. Because for the first time in his life, he didn't know. Jackson Whitmore stared at the article on the screen, his mind churning. Judge Carter, the woman who had torn his life apart, was now the one under attack. And he had nothing to do with it. Which meant someone else did. Someone with power. Someone who wanted her gone. Nathan studied him. Well, Jackson leaned back in his chair, exhaling. Well, what? Nathan hesitated. Are we going to use this? That was the real question, wasn't it? Jackson had every reason to sit back and watch her burn. She had humiliated him. She had locked him up. She had destroyed his name. This should have been poetic justice. And yet, something felt off. Jackson tapped the screen. This case, what's the full story? Nathan pulled out his own phone, scrolling through files. It was a big case back in the day. Corporate corruption. A whistleblower trial. He frowned. Judge Carter ruled against a company that was accused of fraud. People said the case wasn't airtight, but she stuck by her decision. Jackson raised an eyebrow. And now, years later, people care? Nathan hesitated. It's not random, sir. Someone's pushing this. Hard. Jackson drummed his fingers against the table. Who benefits if she falls? Nathan adjusted his tie. That's what I was wondering. And I found something interesting. He slid a tablet across the table. Jackson glanced at the screen, then froze. The article listed names. Big names. Corporate executives. CEOs. Wealthy figures who had lost millions due to Carter's rulings over the years. And one name stood out. Richard Graves. Jackson's entire body stiffened. Richard, he muttered. Nathan nodded grimly. He's one of the people backing this campaign. Quietly, of course. But he's pulling strings. Jackson clenched his jaw. This wasn't justice. This was a hit job. Richard wasn't just taking over Whitmore Corp. He was cleaning house. Erasing anyone who had ever stood in his way. Including Judge Carter. Jackson felt something ugly twist in his gut. Judge Carter had been his enemy. But she had played fair. Richard? Richard was worse than him. And that made Jackson feel something he hadn't expected. Anger. Not at her. At him. Nathan studied him carefully. So what now? Jackson inhaled slowly. Then, against every instinct, he said something he never thought he would. We stop him. Nathan blinked. Wait. What? Jackson smirked. You heard me. Nathan looked like he was having a stroke. Jackson, this is the same woman who put you in jail. Jackson shrugged. And I deserved it. Nathan stared. Who are you? And what have you done with my boss? Jackson ignored him, already picking up his phone. Nathan ran a hand through his hair. I don't get it. Why do you care? Jackson's smirk faded. He thought about it for a second. Then, finally, he said, because I know what it's like to have everything ripped away. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't going to let it happen to someone else. Jackson Whitmore was doing something he had never done before. He was helping someone who had once destroyed him. And he wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because he finally understood what it felt like to lose everything. Maybe it was because he hated the idea of Richard Graves winning. Or maybe, just maybe, Judge Evelyn Carter had been right about him all along. Either way, one thing was certain. He wasn't about to sit back and watch Richard take her down. Nathan paced the penthouse, shaking his head in disbelief. I can't believe this. A week ago, you wanted to ruin this woman. Now you're what? Her guardian angel. Jackson didn't look up from his laptop. Don't be dramatic. Nathan scoffed. Oh, I'm sorry. Is the billionaire ex-con defending the judge who locked him up not dramatic? Jackson ignored him. His fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up every file, every email, every contact he still had in the corporate world. I don't do revenge, he said casually. Nathan snorted. You absolutely do revenge. Jackson smirked. Fine. But this isn't about revenge. It's about leverage. Nathan folded his arms. And what exactly are you leveraging? Jackson leaned back. Richard's entire operation. Nathan frowned. You don't even work there anymore. Jackson's grin was sharp. And that's exactly why I can burn it to the ground. Over the next few hours, Jackson dove deep. He combed through old financial records, pulled up hidden emails, cross-referenced old deals. And the deeper he went, the worse it got. Richard wasn't just coming after Carter. He was using company resources to fund dozens of shady deals. Illegal trades, offshore accounts, bribery. Jackson smirked. Gotcha. Nathan peered over his shoulder. So you're gonna expose him? Jackson's smirk grew. Oh, I'm gonna do a lot more than that. He tapped the screen. You see, Richard is sloppy. He thinks he's smart, but he's leaving trails. If I leak this at the right time, he won't just lose the company. He'll go to prison. Nathan whistled. Damn. Jackson cracked his knuckles. Now we just need the perfect moment to. Bang, bang, bang. A loud knock echoed through the penthouse. Jackson and Nathan froze. Then a voice called out. Jackson Whitmore. Open up. Nathan paled. That's the police. Jackson's jaw clenched. He stood up, adjusting his cuffs like this was just another business meeting. Then, with a calmness he didn't feel, he opened the door. 2 officers stood outside. Behind them, Judge Carter. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Well, to what do I owe the pleasure? Judge Carter's expression was unreadable. Can we talk? Jackson smirked. Depends. Are you here to arrest me again? She didn't flinch. No. I'm here because I think I just made a very dangerous enemy. Jackson tilted his head. For the first time, Judge Carter didn't look in control. She looked like a woman who knew someone was coming for her. And for the first time, Jackson felt something strange. Concern. Inside the penthouse, Carter sat stiffly on the couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Jackson poured himself a drink, watching her. So, he said casually, you finally need my help. Carter met his gaze. I don't trust you. Jackson smirked. Then why are you here? She hesitated. Then she exhaled. Because someone is trying to destroy me. And I think you know who. Jackson took a sip of whiskey, hiding his amusement. She knew. Of course she did. She wasn't stupid. He set the glass down. What do you want from me? Carter's jaw tightened. I want to know what you know. Silence stretched between them. For years, Jackson had been the enemy in rooms like this. The villain. The arrogant billionaire who thought he was untouchable. But now he and Carter were on the same side. And for the first time, Jackson felt something he never thought he would. Respect. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Richard Graves is behind this, he said simply. And I have the proof. Carter's eyes flickered with surprise. You're sure? Jackson chuckled. Would I lie to a judge? Carter gave him a look. Nathan cleared his throat. Just to be clear, you definitely would. Jackson rolled his eyes. Carter studied him carefully. If you have proof, why haven't you used it yet? Jackson smirked. Timing is everything. Carter folded her arms. So what's your plan? Jackson's grin widened. Oh, Judge, he said, leaning closer. We're going to bring Richard Graves down together. Judge Evelyn Carter never thought she'd see the day when she was sitting across from Jackson Whitmore, planning a takedown. And yet, here she was. In his penthouse. In his world. It was surreal. Jackson smirked at her over the rim of his glass. You're not having second thoughts, are you, Your Honor? Carter exhaled, folding her arms. I don't like you. Jackson chuckled. Trust me, the feeling was mutual. She narrowed her eyes. His smirk deepened. Well, you did lock me up, humiliate me, and ruin my reputation. But now, you're sitting in my penthouse, asking for my help. He leaned forward. That's a little satisfying. Carter clenched her jaw. I didn't come here to stroke your ego. Jackson laughed. Pity. Nathan coughed awkwardly from the corner. Maybe we should focus? Carter turned to Jackson. You said you have proof against Richard. Show me. Jackson's smirk faded. His fingers tapped against the laptop beside him. Then, without a word, he spun the screen toward her. Carter leaned in, and what she saw stunned her. Emails, transactions, private messages. Richard Graves was deeply involved in corporate fraud, illegal lobbying, and, worst of all, paying off officials to bury cases. Carter's breath caught in her throat. These are legitimate. Jackson nodded. Every single one. She scrolled, scanning the names. These officials, they're all tied to major cases. Some of them even worked near my court. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Guess that means you weren't just a target of opportunity. You were a problem. Carter's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a smear campaign. Richard was cleaning house. She looked up at Jackson. How did you even get this? Jackson smirked. I have my ways. Nathan rolled his eyes. He's been sitting here for days, hacking into old servers and pulling strings with former contacts. Carter's gaze sharpened. So you broke the law? Jackson held a hand to his chest, feigning offense. Me? Break the law? I'm shocked you would even suggest that. She glared at him. He grinned. Nathan sighed. This is why I have stress headaches. Carter turned back to the screen. This evidence was explosive. It was enough to bury Richard for good. But then she noticed something. She frowned. Wait, this email here. She pointed to a thread between Richard and another executive. He's planning something else. Jackson's smirk disappeared. He read the email. Then his expression darkened. What is it? Nathan asked. Jackson's eyes narrowed. This isn't just about smearing Carter. Nathan leaned over. Wait, is that a bribe transfer? Jackson exhaled sharply. It's more than that. He looked up at Carter. Richard is trying to push you off the bench. Permanently. Carter stiffened. Nathan paled. Wait, he's trying to get her removed from office. Jackson shook his head. No, he's trying to get her disbarred. Silence. Carter's face was unreadable, but Jackson could see the tension in her shoulders. She had been prepared for a smear campaign. She hadn't been prepared for this. He's using false evidence, Jackson said, pointing to the documents. This is fabricated. He's framing you for misconduct so you can't fight back. Nathan's face darkened. If this works, you won't just lose your position. You'll never be able to practice law again. Carter stayed silent. She had dedicated her life to the law, and Richard was trying to take that away. Jackson watched her carefully. Still think you don't need my help? Carter's jaw clenched. Then, finally, she nodded. Jackson smirked. Good, because now, we're going to destroy him. The next day, the game began. Jackson made the first move. He had spent years playing the system, bending the rules without ever getting caught. Now, he was going to use that knowledge against Richard. Step 1. Expose the money trail. Nathan worked his contacts in financial law. Within hours, whispers started spreading about suspicious activity in Whitmore Corp's financials. Step 2. Make the right people nervous. Jackson leaked small hints of Richard's involvement in corruption. Not enough to make a public scandal, just enough to make investors panic. Step 3. Trap him. And for this step, they needed Carter. Carter sat in her office, fingers tight around her pen. Jackson had sent her the script. She hated this. She hated playing dirty. But if Richard wanted to fight in the shadows, then she would drag him into the light. She picked up the phone and dialed. A voice answered. Judge Carter. I wasn't expecting a call. It was Richard. Carter forced herself to sound calm. Mr. Graves, she said. I've been hearing some concerning things. Richard chuckled. I imagine you have. Carter gripped the phone tighter. If you have something to say to me, say it. Stop hiding behind the press. Richard paused. Then, I only do what's necessary. Carter's stomach turned. You mean destroying my career? Richard laughed. Oh, Carter, he said smoothly. You're acting like you're special. This isn't about you. Carter's breath hitched. Jackson had been right. Richard didn't just want her gone. He wanted complete control. Carter's pulse pounded. And if I don't go quietly? Richard's voice darkened. Then you'll regret it. Click. The call ended. Carter's hands shook. But she wasn't afraid. She was angry. Because now, it was personal. She grabbed her phone and texted Jackson. Let's end this. Back at the penthouse, Jackson grinned at the message. Looks like she's in. Nathan sighed. Great. Two of the most stubborn people I've ever met are teaming up. Jackson laughed. Oh, relax, Nathan. Then his grin faded. Because for the first time, he realized something. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about doing the right thing. And for the first time in his life, Jackson Whitmore wanted to win for the right reasons. Jackson Whitmore had played many games in his life. Corporate wars, media manipulation, legal loopholes. But this was personal. And for the first time, he wasn't playing to win for himself. He was playing to take down Richard Graves, to save Judge Carter, to prove, to himself more than anyone, that he was more than just the arrogant billionaire everyone thought he was. It was time. The setup. Richard Graves had always been careful. He operated in shadows, pulled strings from behind closed doors. But Jackson knew something Richard didn't. The higher you climb, the harder you fall. And Jackson was about to kick the ladder out from under him. Nathan set up the financial leaks. Carter worked her legal connections. And Jackson? He made one final move. A public trap. The takedown. The Whitmore Charity Gala was the perfect setting. A night of luxury, cameras, and the most powerful people in the city. Richard couldn't resist. Jackson made sure Richard got an invitation. Richard thought he was walking into a victory party. Instead, He was walking into his own execution. The moment Richard arrived, whispers filled the room. Cameras followed him. And then, Judge Carter entered. The entire room froze. It was the first time the two had been in the same space since Richard's attack on her reputation. Richard smirked, raising his glass. Well, if it isn't the Honorable Judge Carter. Carter didn't flinch. Enjoying your night, Mr. Graves? Oh, very much so, Richard said smoothly. And you? She smiled. I will be soon. Richard's smirk faltered slightly. Then, Jackson stepped forward. Richard's eyes narrowed. Whitmore. Jackson grinned. Richard. There was tension in the air. Richard took a slow sip of his drink. I have to admit, I expected you to stay in hiding. It's refreshing to see you've accepted your loss. Jackson tilted his head. Oh, Richard, who said I lost? Richard frowned. And then, the screens in the gala changed. Every single one. Behind Richard, on every massive LED display, emails, financial statements, and leaked conversations started flashing. Every crime, every corrupt deal, every bribe. Exposed. The room gasped. Richard whirled around. His secrets were playing in real time for everyone to see. Live streamed to the press. Broadcasted across every major news network. Richard's face turned pale. He spun back to Jackson. You? Jackson smirked. Me? The crowd erupted. Is this real? He bribed city officials? He funneled money out of Whitmore Corp? Richard's hands shook. You set me up. Jackson took a slow step forward. No, Richard. His grin widened. You set yourself up. I just let the world see it. Richard's breath was ragged. He looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape. There was none. And then, the doors burst open. FBI agents. Richard's world collapsed. An agent stepped forward. Richard Graves, you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. Handcuffs clicked. Richard struggled. You can't. You don't understand. Judge Carter stepped closer. I understand perfectly, she said, voice calm. And now? So does everyone else. Richard's face drained of color. The man who thought he was untouchable was being dragged out in handcuffs. And Jackson? Jackson just smiled. Because for the first time in his life, he had won the right way. The aftermath. The fallout was immediate. Richard was done. The board publicly cut ties. His associates turned on him. His sentence was inevitable. Whitmore Corp. It was shaken but not destroyed. And for the first time, Jackson didn't want it back. Because he wasn't the same man anymore. The meeting. A week later, Jackson met Judge Carter on the steps of the courthouse. She raised an eyebrow. You're not wearing a suit. Jackson smirked, glancing at his simple button-up and slacks. Trying something new. Carter crossed her arms. So what now? Are you running off to start another empire? Jackson chuckled. Not exactly. He looked out at the city. I've spent my whole life winning. But for the first time, I actually liked how this win felt. Carter tilted her head. So? Jackson turned to her. So, maybe it's time I do something different. Carter studied him. Like what? Jackson grinned. Well, he said, I hear the world could use more people willing to take down corrupt billionaires. Carter laughed. For the first time, it wasn't sharp. It wasn't mocking. It was genuine. She extended a hand. Try not to get arrested again, Whitmore. Jackson smirked, shaking it. No promises. And as he walked away from the courthouse, the city lights glowing around him. For the first time in his life, Jackson Whitmore felt free.